No, I would say in general, like we felt we had a game on hand right off the bat. As people, the first thing I want to know is, would we get data, right? Would people share content, right? Would people share those receipts, those selfies, etc.? Would that happen? And that was a runaway success right off the bat. With that kind of traction, we knew we could mold, right? People are responding, right? The audience in our country, they want to absorb more, right? They're just hungry for more options, ideas. Like eventually, what is Magic Pin, right? In a way, our TG is.
To be very honest, if I was a VC, I wouldn't have funded myself. Like that was how bad the presentation was.
To build scale, you have to think scale.
Sometimes I think too much of money restricts innovation. I think that's a sad part.
So destiny finds you on the road that you take to avoid it.
Whenever you get seat on a rocket ship, you don't ask which seat.
We didn't really ask ourselves like too many questions in terms of how big can we get it.
So it was very, very hard to explain what is UGC.
If you want to implement something, first dirty your own hands.
For me, 1 million to 10 million is where scale.
So again, we had basic teams, struggle, but every day was just learning, which was just amazing.
Listen to founders about their stories and how they built their startups. Here on Maharajas of Scale, with me, your host, Krishna Jonakadla, co-founder of Mango Mobile TV and Vouch. Hey everyone, this is Krishna Jonakadla, your host from Maharajas of Scale. Today, I have the privilege of hosting Anshu of Magic Pin. It's a startup and a venture that I have talked about quite a bit in my own interactions with a lot of entrepreneurs. And I'll tell you as we progress through this recording why I do that. For those of you who don't know what Magic Pin is, if you're in the younger audience, you possibly already know. Magic Pin makes it exciting to discover happening places around the city, and better yet, gives you cashbacks and rewards for you to actually go out to those businesses and do business with them, right? It sounds magical. I'm sure that's the reason they chose Magic Pin. And Anshu, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Krishna. Excited to be here. Yeah.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on right now.
So let me tell you about Magic Pin first, just building on what you said. I'd say we are at one end a growth driver for our partners, retailers, large, small, across categories, food, fashion, electronics, grocery, online, offline, walk into their store or get something home delivered. And on the other hand, to our consumers, we are, I would say, the number one app for providing savings. Number one, especially in the context of offline retail, which is so hard to map. But as technology is growing, as our world is becoming more digital, right, the offline part of the world is also coming online. So number one to that extent. And discovery is kind of embedded. For the longest of time, we used to say discovery app for local. We realized people don't get it that easily. So we stopped saying that. We just say number one savings app. Discovery they'll do anyway when they come onto the app.
Yeah, I know the funny thing is Discovery, possibly they're thinking about Discovery Channel and then National Geographic when you said Discovery app. Getting that copywriting right, especially in the way a consumer or a user would understand, is one of the hardest challenges any startup goes through in the beginning. Right? Awesome. So tell us about yourself. How did you, a little more about your background.
Yeah, so let me start with Magic Pin and then I'll go back. For the last 6 years now, we've been at it with Magic Pin. Prior to that, I'd spent another 6 years with Lightspeed Venture Partners. I was in fact part of the founding team for Lightspeed in India. And this is late 2009 that I joined Lightspeed. And over the 6 years that I was there, I was part of around 10 investments that we did there. The first one is now a public listed company. It's called Indian Energy Exchange, a beautiful company, by the way. And then over the course that I spent time there, did those investments, I was just completely, I'd say, kicked about the opportunity to build a business, to be on the other side of it. I'll talk more about what I learned at Lightspeed in a bit. Going back further, I spent 4 years with Bain and Company. I started with Bain in the Boston office. This is 2006, early 2006. and subsequently came to India as the India office of Bain was getting set up, and then spent enough time till the point I was fascinated by getting closer to entrepreneurship, though didn't have the courage to go all the way. So went to the next step, which was investing. That was at Limsby. And then prior to that, I had done my B school from IIM Ahmedabad, and before that, for 3 years, I was deep inside technology. I was at Motorola and what was then known as Hughes Software Systems. In fact, the itch to build something carried on from those days, which is pre-MBA. And then, in a way, I would say I was fortunate to find the right set of things coming together to transition out from being an investor to being someone who's building a business, which I have thoroughly enjoyed since.
Wow. So Hughes Software,
Yeah.
and which was an entrepreneurial organization itself. I
Yeah.
think those guys had a bit of a culture, at least in the US side of the world.
Yes, HSS, a very strong way to think. This 2001, yeah. So that was my dream company graduating.
Yeah, and for those for listeners who don't know Hughes Software, it's one of the creations of Howard Hughes, which is portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio in that movie The Aviator, right? And then from Hughes Soft to IMA, and IMA, right? Ahmedabad.
That's correct. Yeah.
How did you end up at Bain?
From Ahmedabad to Bain.
Oh, he was a campus recruit.
Campus recruitment, yes. Bain was recruiting for its global offices at that point in time. They didn't have an India office set up yet, but they had in their mind that they would want to put together an India office at some point. So the year I joined, I joined in Boston.
Dude, I mean, Bain in Boston. Boston is a flagship location for Bain, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a HQ. It's a global HQ for it.
Right, and then did you ever run into Mitt Romney there?
No, I did not. I heard a lot about him. I did not run into him.
I know. I mean, awesome. This is amazing pedigree. I remember you're another after Ashish Kashyap of Go Ibibo, who was on our podcast about 20 episodes ago.
Yeah.
I think with Hughes and IMA, and then Bain, and being in the India office of Bain, and then Lightspeed Ventures. Most people would actually say, as soon as they landed at Bain, Boston, Massachusetts, they said life ban gaya. Right?
No, it was pretty good. It was quite amazing. In fact, let me connect the dots in all of these places to some extent. You know,
sure.
Between Hughes and Bain and Ahmedabad, there was also Motorola. So I spent 2 years at Hughes. I really loved the work. Right, we were building products for voice over IP converged networks. That's what was happening in 2001 when I started. In fact, I filed a patent while at Hughes. But the 2 years I spent there was a little bit of this, I think it got figured out, right? I knew what I had to do. And that's why I was curious what next. And I joined Motorola at that point in time. So I moved out from Delhi, which was my hometown, where I studied, where I did my first job. I joined Motorola in Bangalore, largely out of, what else, right? And Motorola was also a great experience. I did some more voice over IP work there, built products. But one thing that hit me when I was out of home for the first time, and I was not in hostel at any point in time, right? I realized the biggest thing to figure out is you have to think of your food 3 times in a day. That was a new problem to solve. But the year I spent with Motorola in Bangalore, one thing which I got certain of is that, building things is one, but I was missing this higher context that what else can one do to break out? And India office of Motorola is actually, or was very empowered. So a lot of work was being done out of this office. But this opportunity to get a more of a generalist scope versus being more of a developer, right? That was very exciting. And that's how I ended up being at Ahmedabad. And in fact, when I was at Ahmedabad, I was quite, it was almost like I could see the code running in the matrix almost, right? I could see like a Therewale ka PNL, right? I never thought of such things in the past. I was very happy doing what I was doing. Crores didn't make sense to me before that. I started to make sense, okay, these are what the numbers mean. And then subsequently getting into Bain was probably another great learning experience, because B School teaches a lot of baseline. But when you work with real businesses, look at their problem, right? That was interesting. Doing that in US, then doing that in India, I was quite fascinated. But at some point, once you've done something enough number of times, it starts to saturate, and that's what I felt. That Bain also, it's great, and I love the people at Bain. I've got so many Bain people connected with us, even at Magic Pin today. But I felt I want to be closer to building something, which I said in the past also, and I did not know what it was. And what I could find was the next best thing, which was to build a business in the business of investing. And I met Bejul at that point in time. He just joined the Lightspeed office and he was looking to build out the team. And I would say I was to begin with quite conservative. VC 2009, and I started the conversation fairly early, right? It's just very early, right? Like, and in a consulting firm, you've got a track and everything, right? You would say, okay, like, do I want to do something which is so different than what's being done? But I'm glad I took that decision at that point in time. I finished the time at Bain at a high, got into Lightspeed. 2009, tech was very early in India. But the kick about saying, okay, let's find opportunities that can give venture-like returns, that was very exciting. I remember my initial days, we would spend time with microfinance companies because that was something as close as you can get to venture-like returns. But subsequently, more technology things happened, and I'm glad that they happened. And in the 6 years that I spent there, I loved that journey. And 6 years is also enough time in a VC business. It's not less, it's not more. It's enough to see the cycle complete. It is enough to see the investments you made, right, how they've done. That's what I was talking about. Indian Energy Exchange was the first company that we'd invested in, that went public. And I felt that if I want to go out and do something, then this might be a good time. I'm anyway taking that bet with my career that VC is also exposed to the same startup ecosystem as an entrepreneur is. But I can hedge my risk to an extent, right? Which is also very satisfying and risk adjusted, probably higher payoffs. But if I think about, I don't need to adjust the risk. If I'm passionate about building something and I believe there's so much that's going to happen, then it was a matter of finding the right team and the right opportunity. And that's how I would say Magic Pin happened, that we could get some of those pieces to converge and then I could go out. So this constant theme was to say, what else, right? What can be interesting? I don't need to worry about like creating more baselines. If I have to creating more upside, right? Where does that come from? And not out of, like, while I'm saying this in a very more financial kind of way, really, but the way I was thinking was more about, if I don't have to worry about anything, what would I go out and do? Let me go out and do that. That's why all of these transitions happen.
Yeah, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the self-actualization.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. What's family? Is family professional, mom, dad?
No, I do have a family now, which is, of course, my mom, my wife. We have 2 kids, aged now 7 and 11.
Okay. Were parents professionals or were they in business?
No, professionals. My dad was, in fact, he was amongst the early folks to use technology. I remember very early in my life, I must have been 8-9 years old. He was interviewed in DataQuest. That used to be the big thing then.
Yeah. You mean the magazine? The
magazine.
Yeah, I know the magazine. Yeah, PC Quest and then DataQuest.
Yeah. So he was a professional. Unfortunately, we lost him very early on. When I was 10, we lost him. So then my mom was in a government undertaking organization, and not very different as a story, right? Middle class, grew in Delhi as locals. Went to a decent school, the Air Force School in Subrata Park. Yeah, and then from there onwards, I would say schooling was quite, I would say, okay, right? Not much happening, kind of do the drill. The action started to happen once I got into college, and then I think things started to open up and I got to see a lot.
So, did you go to IIT or?
No, I went to Delhi University.
And you are an engineering graduate or a commerce?
I did a 4-year degree in computer science from Delhi University.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's where the tryst with Hughes and Motorola comes.
Yes, Yeah. So Hughes was the placement from Delhi University. And in fact, computers were itself, right? Before going to college, I had not interacted with computers at all. So zero exposure. once I got in, I loved it. I got, and I spent the 4 years there really building so much of stuff that by the time the thing came about, okay, what would you like to do? I'd done a bunch of things, and I was fortunate to find a bunch of similar-minded people, right, who will think a little bit in the opposite direction, do things. I remember this term around, right, ethical hacking, etc. I used to do a lot of that in college.
I used to do ethical. I'm a chartered accountant, and in fact, if you are describing the same Motorola office, I think that's the one on Alsu Road in Bangalore.
Alsu Road, that's right. Yeah.
I know it very well because around 2000, 2001, Motorola hived off the semiconductor unit into what is called as onsemi. And I was the auditor for onsemi. I remember coming in to that office multiple times and just to talk to the head that was running that operation, just to discuss accounts and then finalizing stuff like that. So my office was just a stone's throw away from the Alsu Road office. Our office was on Alsu Road as well. So the funny thing is, when onsemi was happening, and this was still although the dot-com bust had just happened, there was still so much excitement about tech and internet. And Cisco at that point in time, which was blazing, was talking about building a Cisco city. And Motorola was talking about building a Motorola city. And I used to joke to my colleagues, I think all the dystopian future that we see in Terminator, Rise of the Machines, I think we'll soon not have castes anymore. And then we'll say the Cisco guy will get married to a Motorola girl. So they will compare companies and then the cities that the companies are founded in. And I would imagine all of that. And one of the accountants there, the girl that was heading up finance, so I would describe, I think her name was Deepa. I would tell Deepa, this sounds so dystopian. I don't want to live in a city where I'm seeing the same guys that I'm working from morning till night. On the left to my neighbor, in the neighboring cubicle is the guy who actually lives next to me. So it sounds so boring. And she used to say, Krishna, I think you're imagining a too far out future. I don't think that's gonna happen anytime soon, and life has discontinuities. But I could definitely see the path, and that was around the time I had founded my first startup as well.
Sure.
But amazing. The Bain part. So I'm just thinking, when it comes to consulting, and I was in KPMG Consulting, so I know that my boss there, actually in the other firm, used to say, consulting is the place where you start getting comfortable with two things. One is uncertainty and the other one is chaos. Right? And because one is uncertainty, many times your brief changes. The brief that you actually start with, and then what you discover once you start digging in, changes. And the second thing that you start seeing is the chaos that most organizations are, constantly in. And you're actually, once you get in, you're asking yourself, geez, why did they engage us? They seem to know all of the stuff themselves. And then if you've read this book called Witch Doctors, there's a book about McKinsey, and then the famous phrase is that consultants are people who steal your watch and tell you the time. So, but they actually don't tell you why that happens, because organizations internally, they know what they want. It's just that they want an external entity, an objective entity to come in, actually endorse that point of view. That's actually the service the consultant or the consulting firm is actually doing, and nobody does it better than Bain, because Bain is from its genesis, it has refused to work with anyone other than the chief executive of the company. So they don't sell to anybody other than the CEO, as far as my knowledge goes. So amazing. And talk about your light speed time. And because 2000, I think India had one bout of startup frenzy, which was the late 90s, the dot-com era. And then everybody and his dad started a website at that point in time. And then even now it happens, everybody and his dad just what they fill in the blanks, that just changes according to the
that's how the world works. Yeah.
fashion of the day. And then you had a little bit before the 2008 crisis. People would start IT service firms. They would start testing firms. They would start. I would be bored out of hell because I used to run a consulting division within an IT services company, and then people would come and say, "I'm starting a testing firm." I would say, "Why in the world would you start a testing firm, dude? Even if you make $2 or $3 million out of it, it's a dead end. It's there's no excitement in that thing. You're not building anything." And I would see swaths and swaths of people do it, and I would say, "This is not for me." There was many a time where I could just get into staffing, recruitment, that kind of stuff, and maybe make $500,000. But I had the same itch that you have, which is to create something. So I constantly kept creating something, and one of them succeeded, and that journey is still on. So talk about the Lightspeed time, because if it is 2009, it happened right after the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah.
Although in the Western media, it's held up as the worst financial crisis after the Great Depression. I've lived through that. I lived in the US at that time. Main Street, other than Occupy Wall Street, Main Street almost came out unscathed 2 or 3 years later. A lot of it got to do with quantitative easing, which the US Fed did. Don't worry about the technicalities of that. So what I mean is, once you were halfway into President Obama's term, which is 2008, he got elected. By around 2010, the US economy was back at a faster clip than it ever was. So how, and I don't know, maybe it's a time bomb ticking. So when you moved back to India, talk about why you moved back to India. That was one. Because you barely spent 4 years in Bain, and you possibly were just getting your feet wet. Maybe you're on fast track to becoming a partner, and then the perks there of being a partner are really good, right? Yachts and charter flights, and then working with CXOs. I know it all looks glamorous from the outside, but it has its own internal non-perks. So why did you move back to India? And then in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and given that there wasn't really much happening on the startup scene, right? Why did you decide to jump into VC, venture capital?
I think there are quite a few things you've asked, right? So let me unpack them, and maybe in chronology. I moved back to India in 2007 after spending, let's say, close to a year and a half at Bain in the Boston office. For me, part of it was, always the plan, right? Bain was going to set up in India. As the office got set up, there was an opportunity to go back. I went back, right? At the same time, even for my own preferences, even when I was going to B school, I remember one of the conversations I had these admits from different schools, right? I remember one of the case studies I had, having spent time at Motorola. It was an idea which was run an app on your smartphone which will let you do voice over IP calls. So this piece about wanting to build something was very core and intrinsic, and I realized that that doing that in US is great, but my network and people who I know, people who know me, right? I felt that there is a to an extent a fair bit of rewiring that needs to be done, and I was passionate about what India can do, still am, and the opportunities that exist here, the problems that can be solved here. So it was an organic path. In fact, my wife had a job there, and we had this choice that which way should we go on that. And she was kind enough to say, okay, let's go in that direction. So she left her job. We came back to India. In fact, the US company that she was at, they let her set up the India office because she was here, and that carried on for some time. But that was a decision, wanting to be here and a defined structure for being here. I'd also done a fair bit of time in the private equity ring fence, as they call it, in Bain. There was a lot of action in US and in India. In fact, when I came in, private equity was really hot. and I was in that, like, from case to case. I was moving every 4 weeks, literally. Right? We'd move from one case to another case, and it'll always be, what are the 3 things you need to believe in to make this investment? Right? A private equity buy side firm would ask us that question. We'll do the work. We'll be smart about it. Come down to the answer on this is what matters. This is what's our view on it. Of course, not our investment, their investment. But having done that a few times, and then that financial disaster that happened, and a lot of the private equity work went away. Instead, we now had clients which were more of corporate clients, consumer, retail, telecom, all of these guys. At that point, all of this bidding for 3G, etc. was happening. So I did a fair bit of work in that area, and all of that was good. What I was missing on all of that was, to an extent, this piece of saying something, but then just moving on from there, right? And then something, and then moving on from there, right? To me, I wanted that itch of building something was not getting scratched, right? So, and I love the people at Bain, the general bar of quality on everything, literally. But I was missing this, to that extent, this way of saying, okay, I want to build something. And that's the point in time when I met Bejul, and I mentioned, right? And he put it in that way also. We are a startup in the business of investing, right? And that was quite inspiring. And to me, it was at least coming one step closer to, I don't know what I want to do. This is 2009 still, right? So very early days, not a lot happening from a tech point of view. But I knew, I had very firm belief tech would happen. More things will happen. And Lightspeed had already made a couple of investments in India. They were warming up to the idea. And if tech mattered, right, then this is a good way to come closer to the action when I don't really know what it is. That was my entry point. Of course, once I came in, I forgot about all of that because there was just so much action. And the business of investing is a business by itself, right? So getting to know people, it was very early days, like the number of funds that existed were minimal, opportunities were there, but very far and few. In fact, I remember my first day at Lightspeed, we'd gone to meet Dinesh at IndiaMart. That was our first day. And at that point, very early days, very hard to see. Of course, Dinesh went on to build a great company, IPO'd that company, but very early to see that. I think a lot of what happened in the Indian internet ecosystem happened over the next decade from there. So not 2009, but when you look at 2009 to 2019, a lot happened. So I was there in the early days of that. I remember doing a lot of work on microfinance, just lending businesses. They're still hot. A lot of them are called fintech now, but they're still very interesting from a business point of view. I remember a fair amount of work even in EPC, kind of, which is just like execution work, right? A lot of working capital, no margins. And then Flipkart happened, right? Like then one round happened, then more of this started to happen. And of course, the market suddenly just heats up like anything, right? And we are being Lightspeed, right? Like our way of, and we were the Lightspeed is the one firm, right? So same fund was being deployed out of US and out of India. So the way to think of a firm in terms of what's the CAC, what's the lifetime value, like the same concepts existed very strongly. And Indian companies are not up to the mark. It's just very early in the market, right? To be able to see them. So now in hindsight, I feel that, we were putting too harsh a lens on a market that was too early. The broad strokes were there, so we probably missed out on some of those opportunities which were interesting. But at the same time, we found our own set of opportunities, right? Indian Energy Exchange was one of them. We were the first financial investors. Very capital intensive in general. That's what the power sector is. But we could find a very asset-light way to build that. And that company did well, went on to IPO. There were more investments that happened. So Krishna, to come back to the question you asked me, right? Why US to India? Why Bain to Lightspeed? I think some of those I just answered, right? That's how those comes.
Amazing. So it's one thing and by the time 2015 happened, it was the wave had actually hit a crescendo.
Absolutely.
Right? Because I came back in 2014 and I still remember when we were building what was called MADS at that point in time. I remember meeting the head of Shoppers Stop Bangalore and he was scared shitless. And he used to say, Krishna, do you think offline will exist? And you know that scary voice, right? When you're scared, you become you have that meek voice and will offline exist? That was the kind of question he asked me, and I would look at him and say, dude, what are you talking about? 2015, a report came out about e-commerce in the US, and it was 9%. And today it's at 13%, and COVID has possibly put it at 15-16%. What a lot of people don't understand is Amazon thrives because somebody else does the showrooming for them. If the physical stores didn't exist, Amazon possibly wouldn't see half the sales that it actually does, right? So people don't actually connect the online and the offline. And then I would tell him, see, online is a great model. It is here to stay. It's here to grow. But make no mistake, offline will always be the larger pie. We live in a physical universe. And I've said this on my past episodes. If you haven't watched the movie Demolition Man, it came out somewhere in the mid-90s. You should watch it. And in that movie, Sylvester Stallone, Sandra Bullock, and Wesley Snipes, those are the three sort of the characters. And Sylvester Stallone and I give everybody this example. Sandra Bullock have an intimate moment. They are supposed to make love, and they are in a room, and Sandra Bullock is at one end, and Sylvester Stallone is at the other end. So Sandra Bullock is from the future, Sylvester Stallone is from the past. So he's been cryogenically frozen, and then he's unfrozen, that kind of stuff. So he's still from the so-called old world. And then they get intimate and say, okay, let's make love. And Sandra Bullock says, okay, yeah. And she doesn't take off her clothes, doesn't do any of that. And they both put a headset on. And then, so she simulates the whole thing. And then she makes all the sounds and stuff. And then she says, it's done. And then Sylvester Stallone cannot believe what's going on. So he's like, what just happened? She said, we did it. She tells him we did it. He said, no, we did not. And so I gave him that example and said, dude, no matter how virtual, how digital the world gets, some things are going to stay physical. So that was the genesis of us continuing to believe in physical. And I said, offline is such an interesting word. With HoloLens and holograms, yes, online will get interesting, but still offline will persist. So I used to see, so my whole rationale at that point in time was everybody's going online. And they're leaving the offline world behind. The offline world is really rich, and even today that is a valid proposition. If anything, COVID possibly has shown that we need more offline interactions because all of us have gone online now. And so where there's, in addition to the frenzy that was going on at that point in time, where there's some other life events that happened and sort of made you jump in. Talk about how you ended up starting Magic Pen.
Very interesting. So I would say one trigger point, right, was late 2014. I spent some time in China. There's the India, I think IMI group that went. Rajanandan was leading it. Like a bunch of folks from here were part of that. I was also part of that delegation, and we met all of those companies in China. And that was an eye-opener for me. I realized we are not even 1% of what we'll be in a decade or 2 decades from now, right? We're really just starting. And like almost everything you can think of, there's a company that provides riders in case you're drunk, like with a folded cycle, who can come, put the cycle in the dicky and then kind of drive you home and then go back, right? That's doing, let's say, 100,000 transactions a day. Like almost every niche use case you can pick, and there's a massive volume that's sitting. So it's a matter of time how technology would percolate our lives in so many interesting ways. And being an investor is also fairly exciting. You get excited about the same thing. But I just felt that if I want to go out and build something, then that came first, that I should go out and do that. Now, one area, which is what you were alluding to, is just this offline space. And I'll get to that in just a bit. But at Lightspeed, I had spent time, right? Like we had looked at Snapdeal in its first avatar, which was about offline. We had looked at Groupon in India. Lightspeed had invested in Living Social in US. We were invested in Dianping in China, which became Meituan Dianping eventually. So the belief on the concept was very much there. It was just that it was not able to start in India. Offline is tough as nails, right? Like while the opportunity is large, cracking it is not as straightforward as if you were to build, let's say, an vertically integrated e-commerce business, right? that also needs money, but this needs just more than money. And what we found was just one way or core insight that if we could use data to first understand the flows of offline commerce, that's what's really missing in offline, right? Like on online, you can track all the click, right, all the way to where it gets purchased. In fact, you see a Gillette razor on Amazon for the next 7 days, it follows you wherever you go. Like the data loops are just so tight. In offline, even though that's 90% of retail, that data doesn't exist. But if you were to able to understand that data, then we have such an interesting opportunity to connect users, retailers, and even manufacturing brands that operate in this close to $1 trillion offline retail space. I think that was the problem statement. We had an approach around how to bootstrap that in a way that it's clever, it's efficient, and it's value accretive to everyone versus having to burn a ton of dollars. I think that was also how at least my and the core team, my co-founder Bridge, etc. are wiring this. So that's how we kind of said this was the thing that you'd go after. The space was known. We had a starting point of view, and both Bridge and I converged on it. And once we said this is what we're going to do, I told this to Bejul, and he said that we know you guys, in fact, both of you. So if you're doing this, we'd back you. And that's how we got incubated out of Lightspeed, in fact. That's how we started MagicPin in late 2015 when we started.
What was the spark? So talk about the first, I think, I remember a growth hack that you guys did. So it's one thing. So what you initially started off with was building the data.
Yeah.
And because you can't monetize, first off, you don't have any data on hand.
Yeah.
Almost nobody does.
Yeah.
Although now I think Google Maps and a lot of them with the amount of location data everybody is aggregating, which Foursquare did a long time ago in the US, are doing, and then triangulating with all kinds of sources and then maybe drawing some decisions. I remember running a Facebook local campaign for a fashion brand we were managing, and I was amazed at the number of footfalls that an online campaign on Facebook did for that particular brand. The brand believed it happened because of a totally different reason. The only thing that had changed was that Facebook ad campaign. But that is Facebook, and then you have Google. You are not Facebook, you are not Google. So which means you have to start somewhere. You need to start getting some data, right? The first thing is you get data. Second thing is you need good amounts of it. And then the third thing is you start looking at ways in which you can monetize that, which means you're driving business to someone. Okay. So talk about how you started off the beginning, where when you saw some traction breakthrough.
So I'll give you still. Before that, let me just also comment a little bit on the meta. In fact, the challenge for offline retailers is that Facebook and Google are ineffective, right? Like the issue is that Facebook and Google don't close the loop on offline retail. They don't so you can what you said can happen, which is sometimes a confusion, sometimes it's a reality. All of these local retailers, right, they would have burned 10,000, 30,000, 40,000 rupees on these channels, and that money would have dissipated into thin air. The challenge is that these are online-only channels. While they work great with online retailers, when you try and get that traffic to come offline, there is no closing of the loop happening, and thus even their own ability, right? And closing of the loop is not just a lat long, let's say, ping. It is also someone going and doing a transaction, which I can track very well. And the heart of MagicPin is actually that ability to close the loop on an offline transaction. Now, let me tell you how we bootstrapped this whole thing. You're right. We did not have any data to begin with. Then, even if once we start to get data, we had to arrange in a way that it becomes actionable to drive business to someone. And then we had to get that person to pay us. And then we had set up a rewards program. So what we get paid, we have to pay something out of that. And thus we are finally left with something which is contribution margin, right? Now we've figured out everything. That whole pipeline works tightly. But our starting point, that I remember, I was still in my final days at Lightspeed, we were running these Facebook campaigns which said that send us a picture from Cafe Coffee Day and we'll recharge your phone with 100 rupees. I remember that was the first thing I'd done. And we got so many pictures immediately, right? Then we tried the same thing in Delhi University. I remember our initial days. We stood on the streets of Delhi University and we said that, send us, we started actually on the picture side, that whichever store you're going to, send us a picture from that store and we will recharge your phone. That was the first call to action. To make things simpler, and this is our first day really, so we had no app thing, right? We said just WhatsApp it to us. So people would send it to our WhatsApp. At some point, the volume became, in fact, in our second, third day itself, it became 100 transactions a day, right? The volume started to swell up. Then we basically patched Freshdesk behind WhatsApp, and WhatsApp didn't allow bots in those days. This is 2015. So we kind of created a bot of our own, like a Python script or something, which would send these transactions to Freshdesk. The agent would reply on Freshdesk to charge the phone. And in fact, I remember in early days, I was charging the phone or standing on the street. Bridge was standing on the street, I was charging the phones. And then we could recharge the phone. We'll multiplex the message back to the user on WhatsApp. And what that told us is that our loop for getting users to share data for a reward, that will run away like hell in India. That was the first thing we wanted to see, right? Whether that happens or not. So soon enough, once this was working, we switched WhatsApp from after first transaction, we said to users, you now need to come on our app. And in fact, our first app was just an open source app that we picked up. We just hacked it, pieced it together, but it was really an open source chat client. And at one point, I remember what we did is we put a magic wand on that chat client. If you press the magic wand, then you see the other cool selfies that others have sent from that. And we realized people who were clicking on that button, they were 30% more likely to stick with us. They would continue to do that action, right? And basically, it was not just the reward, but over a period, the engagement started to play a key role in knowing people around you, in discovery. And then we built our first version of the app, which was actually a good 6 months down when we could get out with it, which had this base insight of the homepage was a feed page where people from around you would show on the app, which it still does. And they are going to different places, etc., etc. All of that happens. And the other page that we would have, which is also still the other page, was that for every picture that you send us, of course, we've now gone easy. You don't need to send us your selfie, etc. You can send us a picture of the bill. Now, actually, you don't even need to send us a picture of the bill. Because there are more data sources, we allow you to just allow us to read your SMS, and then we can read your credit, debit, UPI transactions, and still give you reward points for doing that. So we are as we grew, we found more sources of data, perhaps which lowered the friction for our users, but let us understand where are they going, what are the places that they hang out, and for that we gave them points. That is the business model, that you earn points for sharing your spends. And what we do is, because we know your spends, we will match you to the right set of paying partners, and those paying partners will accept those points that we have given you. So we take all of this organic demand in neighborhood and point it to our paying partners. And the business is so wired into that way of thinking, is that when we start a new locality, and now a lot of our business is built out in many areas, so it doesn't happen as often. But when we start a new locality, we just follow wherever the consumers are going. We look at where the receipts are coming from. We would prioritize those merchants, and in a way work backwards, like take the GST, convert the GST to a phone number. On that phone number, WhatsApp or SMS, a link to the merchant where he would see pictures of his customers, his average order value versus competition, his repeat rate versus competition. We'll tell him you rank number 7 in your neighborhood. There are 6 people ahead of you. And in fact, because of this way of thinking, which is consumer first, and then follow the consumer to find the merchant, we were very efficient. Even today, we have 0 feet on street for merchant acquisition. And
how do you get the competition data of the other merchants? They are 7th or 6th.
Oh, the users are going to all the stores, right?
Oh, okay. Based on the users.
Based on the users, right? So we could tell your users, these are the 6 people who come to your store. By the way, these 6 people also go to your competition, right? And those guys are ahead of you. So yeah, the merchant cares about 2 things. One, his own customers, which we had authority on because of receipts. Second is competition, which we also had an authority of because we knew the locality. So the business is actually what I referred to previously, right? That offline is such a big market. The challenge is, because there is no data, the burn on getting both the sides of the network. One side you have supply, other side you have demand, right? That becomes a challenge. We started by saying that, okay, we'll not care about supply to begin with. We'll just reward the consumers. Let's get the demand in. Once the demand is in, we will get that supply where the demand goes, right? And thus create a more cohesive system that kind of feeds off itself and then just continues to go. That core still hasn't changed. I guess we've added more sources of data, and I'll talk more about it as we go. But the heart of Magic Pin remains looking at different sources of data to understand this flows of offline commerce, and then connecting users, retailers, and manufacturers through our reward.
This is phenomenal, right? I have a confession to make at this point. I remember reading that funding story. Magic Pin raises, I think, 5 million or whatever that was. Selfie app, Magic Pin, and then when I click it, and then I look inside, and then it says 100,000 people have sent selfies, and God's honest truth, I would say, which idiot funded this app? I ask myself that question, okay? Because what happens with most people is that, and so let's say you are playing, for most Indians, I think carom board is a game that they understand. The striker, when you hit the striker, you're actually hitting the striker not to hit the striker, but a coin that you're aiming at, right? So what you're actually doing with this kind of stuff is actually building a community first. Because you first need to build a community, and it's the number one. I won't even say understood. Number one not understood aspect of building ventures. I mean, God's honest truth. But there's also another side of it. There are very few of them that actually put a community together, because most of the time they're just putting a community together for the sake of it. See, in your case, you knew that you had to get the data. You knew what coin you were actually hitting. Now, this was a means to an end. Now, it was going to remain the means to an end. The methods were going to change. But that was the tactic. Right. So it is one thing to it is one thing to understand tactics. A totally different thing to confuse tactics with strategy.
Absolutely.
Right. So in this case, take cred, for instance. It's almost the exact same hack. Isn't it? It's now the only thing is, instead of a selfie, it's a credit score. Right. And the beauty of it is, even today I see so many. And the other day, when I'm helping the current startup with its growth path, I told them, hey, the best aspect of it is, what the coin looks like. You know which coin you want to hit. Now go figure out how to build the community part. Because community is your distribution channel. Your captive today. Your Magic Pin user base is captive audience. They are your captive distribution channel. Right.
Absolutely.
Anybody that's building their customer base on Amazon, Flipkart, Facebook, WhatsApp, if they wanted to scale nationally or even go beyond national borders, need to understand that though you will hit some glass ceiling at some point in time, and you'll never own that audience, right? So anybody that has dreams of scale needs to figure out a way to build a community, which I think you did masterfully. And the beauty of it is, it's a gift that keeps giving, right? So all you need to do, and I don't know if you've done this exercise, I've analyzed in India, well, in the West, you possibly have 50, 60, even that's a big number. Especially the ones that have understood the community aspect. Most people build community for the sake of it. Even in the US, okay, let's put a community around it. Let's put social media, follow, like, share, that kind of stuff. But there's no method to that madness. Just because people want to discuss, you just put a community around it. But there are a handful of them, or maybe a little more than a handful of them, that understand what this is. So PayPal did that. Refer a friend and you get $10 and your friend gets $10. Right? That refer hack. You had Dropbox that did that 5 GB free when your friends do that. And Groupon, for instance, right? Which asked people to invite. There are a few of them that have figured out. And another thing is, so it's one thing to figure out the community building and to actually know why you're building that community for. Even today, globally and in India, I feel it's a very understood. It's a science. It's not art, to be honest. It's science. And I've been reading tomes and tomes about it, over the last few years about how to do that. So I have great respect for what you did, because I think for the user it's a selfie.
Yeah.
But that picture has a lot of information in it, right?
Yeah.
It has the area, it has the location,
Yeah.
it has the mall, it has the brand,
Yeah.
it has a whole host of things around
Yeah.
it, using which you can triangulate and say, okay, this is exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and selfie was easy. Along with the selfie, there was always the receipt that came along, and with the receipt, we knew we got this GST, which we could reverse engineer into phone number, the products that are being bought. In fact, there's so much value from that receipt that sits, right? Selfie in a way become the quirk, right? Oh, this company pays you for selfies, right? Which is great, right? Everyone talks about it. Good for us, right? But behind all of that, like this aggregating all of that information, right, and making it actionable for a retailer who we are marketing, large guys as well as small guys, right? That was, I would say, the interesting part. And we always knew, as you said, what we are going to do, but it took us a lot of, I would say, meandering, trials, errors, right? Like it was a new thing. We didn't have something to copy from, which is a good thing, but also a bad thing because you're then learning as you're going on that.
Right. So, who actually led all of this? I'm pretty fascinated because it has to be some sort of a mind that has some insight into human behavior. And because what this actually tells us is somebody looked at some kind of a trend. If you look at what the likes of Paytm, Freecharge, and the MobiKwik guys did, they again targeted the same population, which is a college-going crowd, the young ones. And then they said, every time you do a recharge, I'll give you points, which is exactly what Freecharge did. So I have a term for that, and it's called high-frequency behavior, right? So anything that's a high-frequency behavior, if you can align yourself with it and organically find a motivational aspect, now you're going to get gold out of it, provided you know how to follow through.
Correct.
With that.
No, absolutely. I think, Krishna, it was that. I would not say, that, and we are generally like all of us are very like first principle, more engineering than so more, I would say, product, but perhaps less UI and more just systematically data engineering, like pulling those pieces together. So very objective in terms of like, is this working or is this not working? If this is not working, not stopping at ye nahi chal raha hai, but what is the way to make it work? So I would say just that rigor of saying, and that goes back to all of the training that all of us had before coming here, to say like, yeah, I know there's value in that receipt, for instance, right? As you said, right? If I can get the habit to come in, at some level it comes in, and then I need to just make sure that I can give value for the points, because once someone's got into the habit of it, you feel almost, and we heard this from our users, that if I don't do it, I feel I'm missing something. I'm not doing what I should be doing, which is good for me. So I think we got into the habit of it, and we kind of grew this very nicely over a period. And it's not, as I said, right, without hiccups. We tried so many things. Initially, the points could be used fungibly everywhere. Over a period, we realized as we added more categories that, let's say, the points were being generated more on, let's say, a low margin category like grocery, but being used at a high margin category like, or the other way around, sorry, being generated at, let's say, a restaurant, but then being burned on a grocery store, which is okay from the consumer point of view, but perhaps not okay from the supply point of view. So how do you balance those pieces? How do you balance those without letting the consumer experience get hit? Right? So in a way, we realized over a period, we are the RBI of this economy that we are running. Right? There are a bunch of levers that exist around adding liquidity, sucking liquidity, adding that at a user level. So all of those pieces, finally, I would say we just kept problem solving one after the other. And the good thing I would say is that we had a lot of tools. We still have a lot of tools, right? Because the fungibility of the points economy, that's helpful, right? The other part is, the engagement that we get on the transactions, the community piece that you spoke of, right? So the more you get validation that my friend did this, my friend went here, so many people went here, right? That's the other piece. So the combination of both of those things always has given us enough room to try out more, like get more juice out. And over a period, if you give things time and you keep applying yourself, I think then the roads start to open up, right? So I would say we started with building the GMV, which is in our business just the summation of all the receipts, the spends that is coming in. Then we went from where to calling something monetized GMV, which is where we get paid for that GMV. Otherwise, the receipts don't pay us, right? But if they go to the right merchant, then we get paid. And then from there on, we went to like finding margin opportunities, because every time points are used, right? We not only do we gratify the user, but we also add more to our margin profile. So I think this journey just took time, and I would credit it largely, I would say, to we believe in these three things within the organization, right? We talk about this curiosity, which is really important, but alongside curiosity, you need to bring frugality, because and then the third piece we talk about is to have ownership of the problem. Now, in most cases, if we are able to blend these three things together, and in a way, frugality is just to force there is curiosity. Otherwise, you can own something, put a lot of money, and kind of get the numbers to go. But when you are frugal, that's when you get the best ideas out. That's when you build something which actually ends up creating a moat. So I would say it is just this constant rigor of saying, I know the goal, I know this is where I need to get to, and I'll keep trying things till the time they align, and then we move forward. So not one person, I would say. Now we've been doing it over the years, right? Like I would say it's just the culture of saying that this is a goal. We believe we are smart enough. We believe there's an opportunity. If it's not happening, it'll happen if we try it enough.
Amazing. I actually will combine all of curiosity, frugality, and ownership into one term, and I will call it paranoia. Okay. Paranoia, unfortunately, has a negative connotation to it.
Yeah. No,
but if you've read Andy Grove's Only the Paranoid Survive, you'll actually realize that if you go and look back, it's a positive kind of paranoia. Which is actually driving you and saying, okay, now we got this. Now we got to go to the next stage. Now, how do we look at it? Because you're constantly tinkering, you're constantly working at it, and then saying, okay, let's make this work. Let's make this work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's that, I would say, positive active paranoia, if that's a term, that drives you, because you are not taking whatever position you are in for granted.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you're curious, saying, okay, where does it lead next? And you're not betting the farm. You can't bet the farm because you only have so many experiments left, right? If you bet the farm. And then ownership means you are going to see through it. So I would say paranoia, but that's amazing. So talk about a couple of things. One is, how long did it take for you to for you to figure out that you had a game on hand? That's one. It's one thing to have 100,000 selfies and say, okay, that's great. Because most people, the biggies have possibly a totally different reason. You spoke about FB, Google not closing the loop, right? Because I think there is a degree of hesitation to get into the offline world. When I still have 3.5 billion of humanity left to cover, why would I actually get in and then touch the offline world? Facebook acquired Find.com, and then they'll make those acquisitions just to keep checking some of those marks. But still, there is value in touching the offline world, right? Which you spoke about. So, at what point of time did it occur to you that you had a game on hand? One. And you spoke about some things that didn't work. Were they the ones that happened before the first few experiments didn't work, or the first couple of experiments worked and then a few foundered? So talk about those two. The trigger when you had the feeling that, I think we have a game on hand. And second, what were some of the things that didn't work?
So I would say in general, like we felt we had a game on hand right off the bat as people. The first thing I want to know is, would we get data, right? Would people share content, right? Would people share those receipts, those selfies, etc.? Would that happen? And that was a runaway success right off the bat. With that kind of traction, we knew we could mold, right? People are responding, right? The audience in our country, they want to absorb more, right? They're just hungry for more options, ideas. Like eventually, what is Magicpin, right? In a way, our the core TG is this 18 to 30 year old. People who are very aspirational, are exposed to world media, want the best, but are also very value oriented. They want their 100 rupees to do more than that, right? They want their 100 rupees to do 110. right? So aspirational but value conscious, not cheap. So they want the best things that they can possibly get. Maybe inch up a little bit more. Maybe we'll switch some time for money. That was the core audience we went after, and we found they were lapping it up, right? They were loving it. So right off the bat, we had this sense that okay, we've got this piece, and we've got this piece in a way that we can understand users, their consumption pattern, and match it to the places where they'll go and spend, and we'll get paid for it. Okay, that was the first thing. First obstacle. We always knew it's hard to get the local merchant who's really value conscious to give money. Absolutely, right? Always knew it in theory, learned that in practice also. Like we said, oh, we gave you so much business. These are the pictures of people, receipts, etc., etc. He said, this is great. I love it. But I can't pay right now, as you'd expect, right? And we realized, oh, this is not going to scale. Of course, we knew that, but so far, if you look at local businesses in India, all the public companies that are going, IndiaMart, Just Dial, Zomato, they're all around local businesses. So it's not that the guy can't pay. They're very value oriented. They'll pay if you drive value. We realized we'll end up being like 10,000 people feet on feet if that's how we build it. We turned it around and we said the points that are being earned on MagicPin can be used only at MagicPin partners. Now what happened is that we had payables towards the merchant, because the user would go and say, I want to use my 100 points. The merchant would say, yeah, I've signed up on MagicPin, use your 100 points, right? And then the money would come to MagicPin, because the card plus points would be first received by MagicPin, and then MagicPin would deduct its commission and then pay to the merchant, right? So big problem, great solution, right? And we said, okay, good. And that was, I would say, a turning point, because then the system became self-sustaining, right? More users, more merchants, more users, right? And kind of kept going on. The second thing that I have already mentioned, right? It was that even though this system got set up, we were finding imbalances in the system, because people could use as many points as they have at any merchant. And that's when we brought in that every merchant, how much points you can burn would be a function of how much that merchant is paying, which is again a function of the category that guy is in, how much is he paying us, how aggressive is he, etc. So, for example, a McDonald's would work at a 10% savings opportunity, while let's say Jumbo Burgers, which is a very interesting opportunity, would need 20%, right, to drive the same amount of business. But both can coexist on MagicPin, and we can split the business in the right way. So at that point, it became, in a way, an AdWords, right, but for offline, where we could match the right demand with the right supply, with the right amount of display inventory, but with also the right amount of incentive. And that became one more thing, right, which came in, and that went from there. Then over a period, as we are growing, right, so these are some of the problems that we are solving now, we realized that our first TG is super happy, they are going to do a lot of things, but we need to expand. The concept of local is not just for this 18 to 30. It's for everyone, right? It's for housewives, it's for people who are earning more, they're discreet, like more discreet about what they're doing, right? So he said, okay, let's add these SMSs. That's a new way. So no clicking of selfie, no clicking of picture of bill. You just give us the permission to read, and we will make sure that as we learn about you, and if you want to give those bill pictures, you learn more if you want to, right? But regardless, you can keep going and we'll give you more. Then we've added more things. We're just doing something now with Pine Labs, which is very interesting, where we're saying a user's registered debit or credit card, if it's swiped on a Pine Labs POS, we'll allow earn and burn even without the MagicPin app. So we are saying our concept works, right? And to that extent, large issuers, large networks, right? They can all add to that low margin card swipe a high margin value, which is coming from MagicPin's partners' savings, right? In a way, it's a win-win for all. Consumers, issuers, are partners because they get the business from it. We are now plugging into our retailers' POS, where 100% of the bills that they are printing, we are not the POS, but whatever they are printing comes to our backend. And as a result of that, we understand whatever this retailer is selling. So these are all different sources of data which let us enrich. In fact, this retailer POS business, that opens up an opportunity on the manufacturing brand side. Because we know, let's say, how much of Parle Hide and Seek got sold at one retailer. And we incentivize the retailer to say that if you sell more, then you can earn more, because Parle pays us and we pay part to you and part to ourselves and part to the consumer, right? So this offline economy is just opening up as more data is coming in, and we are kind of layering that in. Krishna, if you give me the permission, I'll add one more piece to the paranoia thing that you spoke of. Huh? Absolutely,
go ahead.
Right? That's the heart of it. Huh? And I would say, if I look 10 years out, right? We are very concerned about what will happen 10 years out, right? What's the role of local? We are super long on local, 10 years out also. Why is that? Because some things we are just humans, right? As you gave the example of Demolition Man, right? Absolutely, man. Many categories will remain offline because they're experience oriented, but the discovery can still start online. At the same time, even very functional categories, right, which are unplanned, grocery, chemist, I don't wait for 2 days for that, right? I want it now, right? I want it in an hour, right? All of those categories will be, in a way, fulfilled by the local retailer. Because think about all of the inventory that already sits around in the local markets. Think about the amount of working capital that's sitting in that supply chain, right? Why not leverage that, right? And it will happen. So while some verticalization will happen, right? Some horizontals will do home delivery, are doing home delivery, some verticals will do it. But if the local merchant is enabled, that provides a very different kind of game. And I do believe that as the world moves more and more online, whatever remains offline will remain offline because we are humans. But even what goes online for home delivery, the local retail will have a very strong role to play in the fulfillment of it. Now, we've not anyone else has cracked like the catalog and the inventory at a local grocer. It's a hard problem to solve. Now, we have got our ways, right? We are saying that we know 100% of the receipts that are coming from here. From the flow of SKUs, we can estimate the stock of SKUs, right? Tough problem, but it's a path to solving it. And we are finding that to be successful. So we are concerned about what happens. We think local has a very strong role to play. And we are all in to that extent that we will get local to play that way.
Very interesting. In fact, yesterday I had Karthik Venkateshwaran of Jumbo Tail on our platform, on our podcast. They've, I think, now crossed 50,000 retail stores. They are in a sub-segment of the stores that you're talking about, which is the Kirana, the local Kirana or the grocer. And I think you're bang on in terms of how the Kirana can service. It's a vastly unorganized market. And I think once the current crop of older generation, because the older generation, see, the way the Indian economy has largely functioned is the government is virtually non-existent when it comes to income. And I wanted to bring this up when you spoke about your visit to China. The reason there is an app, you remember these iPhone ads when somebody would say, hey, I want to do X, and then there would be a smart aleck in a party that would say there's an app for that. And in China, that ecosystem exists today because largely discretionary income has made its way into the hands of people.
Yes.
What is not... I am a ardent believer of the resilience. If whatever India is today is because of the vibrancy and the magic of its people. We succeed in spite of our government. Right? So why we haven't exactly seen the taken off or any of these use cases is not because of lack of innovation or lack of awareness. It's purely because our economic engine hasn't put discretionary income in the hands of people. So as a result of that, it has created a very inefficient system. So today, one of the functions of that inefficient system is a local grocer. Right? So the local grocer, 20-30 years ago, whenever they started, they came from these tier 2, tier 3 towns where they really did not have any job. Manufacturing has been dead for a very long time. Agriculture is back-breaking, hardly earns anything. They would show up in the city and then they would say, okay, what can I do here? There's no training for anything. Job-oriented courses or institutes virtually dried up a long time ago. Even if you did go to the government tool training institute, there weren't any manufacturing institutes. So manufacturing companies, they would say, okay, let me put up a Kirana store. So these guys put up a Kirana store, and then largely these Kirana stores, there's no rhyme or reason. You would, 20 to 30 years ago, you didn't have many brands. You had Parle, you had some of these, a few, you have a lot more today. So you would buy all of these in bulk, and you would just have these bins and then, wrap it up and then give. And that model has in spite of so many brands existing, that model still persists today. Many of the kids don't want to do it. They're kids who have seen them grow up. They've gone to schools, they've gone basic modicum of education, and they've said, okay, I need to change. I think when that happens, people like Jumbotail and you together, because the journey is beginning online.
Yeah.
And I'm possibly saying, okay, these 30 items which I want otherwise Big Basket to send me.
Yeah.
I just rather hop
Yeah.
onto my bike and then go to the neighborhood grocer. All I want to know, why am I going to Big Basket?
Yeah.
Because I don't know if this is available in Big Basket.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if I have that X Mart or Y Mart, which is either powered by Jumbotail or Magic Pin, can actually fulfill it, why would I just wait for this to show up? I mean, there is a subset of people that are possibly in this huge apartment complex, and then I have to navigate through these bad roads and infrastructure, and I want the delivery guy to do all of that navigation and show up. But in the near future, when infrastructure improves, and which I'm sure there are only so many venues where people can continue to be taken for a ride all the time. Infrastructure is the last remaining bastion, and when then that actually dries up, they'll move on to sophisticated deals. The smaller crooks will disappear, and then just like the West, you'll only have bigger crooks in the bigger political system, right? So that's bound to happen. But I have a different question for you, right? Some part of me tells me that COVID has put a little bit of a spanner in the works for you.
No, not a little bit. Yeah, absolutely a big one.
Okay, a big one, right? And then I think it's forcing you to reinvent yourself.
I think 15 months back, I would have said this statement is true. Now I would say we are done with that phase. So what happened in April 2020 is our business disappeared. We were built for getting people to go to a store.
Yeah.
No one's going to store. There is lockdown. You can't step out of your house. Everything's vaporized, right? And we realized that the local guy is there, the user is there, the transaction needs to happen. But there is the footfall business is what's gone. And we immediately, I remember, right, April itself, we took the decision that we will enable home delivery from our local. We started on that then. It took us time, right? Good, by the end of the year we had, but now at this point, the second wave, in fact, of the pandemic didn't hit us as much. First wave just kind of wiped us out, and we built it back to a similar level. But second wave, we've bounced back to already ahead of where we were in March 21. So a lot of that is to do with the fact that we said we are offline retail, but that doesn't mean offline retail doesn't do omnichannel. So we are omnichannel at the same time. So we've come back. And now the interesting piece is that we've got a new engine that's firing, which is this home delivery engine. That engine, and offline volumes are, by the way, still not where they were, even in March 21. But our business is back to where it was on an overall basis. So when both of these engines start firing together, right, we'll just go to the moon, right? So that's basically where we stand today. In fact, if you were to ask me the last hiccup, right, that was this March 20 hiccup where we said, oh, what do we do now? We were literally at that position that do we wait for the pandemic to get over and come back? And I'm now glad in hindsight that we took that decision to say, you're not going to wait, right? This is this new path. And delivery it's an own animal by itself, right? We were consciously staying away from it because we didn't want to move boxes and the associated complexity which comes alongside that. But now we've fully embraced it. We're not doing delivery by ourselves, but we're tied up with a bunch of partners. And in a way, I think what will happen with delivery is also just like what happened with payment gateways, right? At some point, everyone is writing it themselves. And over a period, you've got sophisticated layers and service providers underneath that. So I think that part of the business, as infra improves, I think delivery would be a core part of that proposition. And we can build on top of it and still service our consumers and our retailers.
So two questions. That I'm glad you pivoted, but I still, in my mind, I don't even think you have scratched the scratch of the surface yet.
Yeah.
Because offline is such a big beast.
Yeah, absolutely.
The points angle is just one particular gateway into certain parts.
Yeah.
Which is your most popular? I'll hold my question, but I want to know this. Which is your most popular segment? So food and fashion and electronics. So if you were to look at it, which are the top three?
Those, I think in that order. And last one is grocery, right? Not
Last
very
one.
different, but food, fashion, electronics, grocery. These are the four. And pharmacy is the new one, which is kind of jumping now.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So in all of this, each of these, in fact, if you look at the challenges that a grocer has, is very different from the challenges that a fashion boutique or a brand has.
Yes.
Right? Because if you just use one layer, which is COVID, the grocer was actually, many of the grocers saw huge business last year during the lockdown, purely because everything other than groceries were allowed to stay open. Everyone else was forced to shut down.
Yes. Correct.
And with footfalls not actually coming back, and God knows how many waves the COVID is going to have, the discovery aspect still lies unfulfilled when it comes to places like fashion.
Yeah.
Food is possibly touched by Zomato and the likes, which I suspect why you got Deepinder on your board recently. So I'll let you answer, why you got him on the board. So what I'm thinking is, in your mind, do you still see interesting opportunities? Because you said you're long on hyperlocal and then offline, which means you still have a long ways to go. I'm actually surprised you haven't hived off, let's say, one part of Magic Pin to say, hey, I think there is juice in experimenting. It's another story if you want to scale it, but a totally different aspect to say, let's hive off, let's say, the pharmacy part of it, whatever is taking, and start doing some experimentation to enable discovery of a different kind here, and see what we can make of it. Because today, fashion, it was, I don't know if you can attest to this, it's a poster child for everything that could go wrong in investing in India. Outside of Myntra, very few, the graveyard of fashion startups is actually huge, right? And nobody's really solved the problem that exists in fashion, which is touch and feel and the storeroom experience. Nobody's actually solved. So which begs the question, because you have so many users, why haven't you tried? Have you tried, or is it somewhere on the cards?
Just to repeat the question, Krishna, so that I answered specifically, are you referring to why have we not tried fashion, for instance? Like what's it?
No, some segment. Because see, the points is one aspect. Of getting people onto the platform.
Yes.
But yet there are still nuanced discovery that needs to happen. Lead gen.
Sure.
So is that somewhere on the horizon, or is that still in?
Yeah, I think discovery goes hand in hand with content, right? You can't. So if I go again to that 10-year horizon, right? There is going to be fragmented market, right? And trust and discovery are very important elements that will let you transact in that fragmented 10 years hence online first market. And the way to solve that problem of trust and discovery is through content. And there are contents of different kinds, right? There are different layers. It starts with, I would say, at one level, like functional content, which is lat long, phone number, address, goes to ratings, reviews, then goes to the content of the store, which is the catalog I was referring to, right? What's being sold inside the store, right? And then perhaps there's this trust and discovery is also solved by transaction content, right? If I go to a certain set of places, like my people who know me or who are in my community, they might get trust out of that transaction data also. So there are layers of content which solve this trust and discovery problem which you're referring to. And that is actually the heart of it. So we have two levers really to drive business to a partner. The first one is a hard lever, but it costs us more money, which is the use of points, right? And we use that, right? As and when we need to. And absolutely, Magic Pin is about savings, right? So we use that. But the softer lever, which actually cuts very long and deep, right, is this content piece. And we had built a really nice way for both soft categories we have in our system, which is fashion as well as food with this. So I can see where my friends go and hang out. I can see a stream of pictures or videos from those places. In fact, we would work with a bunch of guys like a Lifestyle, a Shopper Stop. They would ask popular people on Magic Pin to come to their stores, click videos, right? Like a Fossil or a Titan. And all of that would get propagated to the followers of these people. And which is fairly large given our scale now. So that part is why I would say a small retailer or a large fashion brand, both guys would love us. A small retailer on a store opening or new launch would invite our people, and when I say our people, these are not our employees, these are magicians as we refer to them, right? These are people who are influencers in our system. But the interesting piece about MagicPin is, like other social networks, we are about local. We are about offline commerce. So all of that content is directly tagged to a place where someone can go to and save money if you're on MagicPin. So the discovery starts on the soft side and then closes the loop on the harder side. And I would say to that extent, that's a hard problem that we have solved and we are continuing to scale on. The newer set of problems that we've picked up are for the harder categories, which is pharmacy, grocery, where the catalog is more important. And that's where we are kind of now building this new loop of saying receipts will generate the catalog and the inventory, right? Such that we can get that part of the content. So again, right? So there's some functional content, some transactional content, and then some deeper content, right? Which varies then by category. And each of these categories, as you rightly said, needs to be solved by itself. But the interesting part is, finally, as a human, it's the same guy who's consuming all of these things, right? So we can, depending on the category, show a different set of things, but still be with the user. And our points economy connects all of these together. Like, even though we are horizontal, you can earn on fashion, burn on grocery, earn on pharmacy, burn on food, right? Like all of that cross-pollination just keeps happening and keeps the network rich. And what we've found is the biggest value driver for our users is actually the density in a locality. Because the more users in a locality we have, the more merchants we have, the more savings options, the more places to go to, the more diversity, right? Which is how local also thrives. So rich, dense markets, right? That's what drives users and merchants together. So to go back to your question, absolutely, I might have made it sound like a one-trick simple thing, but it's not really. It's fairly complicated, goes category by category, and there are different set of problems to solve in each of them.
No, that was not what I meant. What I meant was you're going to get into deeper and deeper experimentation.
Yes.
But I think you answered my question. One question is, I don't know about China, but why haven't you gone global?
We've tried Indonesia as one market, and that market has been promising.
No. I sorry to cut you short. I don't know what this fascination with Southeast Asia is. We all feel that it's culturally homogeneous, and it is anything but culturally homogeneous. But for a lot of this, take the US for example. I know the cost of doing business is way different there than compared to here. But look at what Foursquare tried. Unfortunately, I think Foursquare never capitalized on some of the things that they did. There was a company called Shopkick. I don't know if you remember Shopkick. Most of them have been flash in the pan kind of things that have not really brought it all together.
Yeah,
there is still an online to offline model like the one that you're working with that could succeed. And I'm saying
the honest answer to that is management bandwidth, right? Like there are a bunch of things to solve here, so much more ground to cover here. So let's get deeper on this. India is a tough market, right? No doubt about it. But we are in the midst of doing all of that. So might as well just put our head down and go deeper versus opening one more front that takes up.
Got it. Not mile wide, inch deep, but inch wide, mile deep.
Correct. Absolutely. I think that's the answer to that.
Amazing. And so, how much funding have you raised till date?
We've raised around $40 million so far.
Okay. Operationally profitable?
Operationally profitable at post-marketing. So quite deep to that extent. If we keep doing what we are doing for a few more months, we'll be cash flow positive. That's what we're aiming.
Okay. Talk about numbers, scale numbers, users, merchants, that kind of stuff.
So we have 5 million monthly active users on the platform. We are focused more on the top cities and the segments that I spoke of in the past. So 80% of our business would come from the top 20 cities, and the next 30 cities would do the remainder. And that's also, as I spoke of density, right? It's very deliberate that we've gone about it and built it that way. We have close to 1 million merchants where our users go and they would send transactions. Like that's the total base of what we are working with. Out of that, we have some 150,000 merchants who are paying us now, where our users can go and redeem their points. So that's the scale. What we are looking to do is more of the same. We've got the core recipe figured out, where users bring GMV, which brings merchants, which brings revenue, which brings contribution margin. That whole pipe is tightly set. What we need to do more and most is just keep increasing the number of users on the platform, and that's what our primary focus is at.
Sure. So where does Deepinder fit in all of this?
Oh, I think he's he's a rock star, largely for having gone through that journey of Zomato and building an organization that, honestly, I feel does all of us proud, right? I'm really glad and honored to have him on the board, apart from him being a celebrity of sorts, but just the grit it takes to be able to accomplish that, right? To go through that journey, whatever is thrown at you, and you know, right, building business is not easy thing. Being able to take that journey all the way, I just think there is enough and more to be excited about and to learn from. More than anything else, it is that. Of course, he's got specific understanding of offline ecosystem, having worked in a category, and all of those things. But honestly, to me, that's second order. The more important piece is, having gone through that journey and the wisdom that comes alongside that. I think having him on the board alongside other people who we have, who I think equally highly of, I think that creates a good mix and keeps us honest.
When I was researching for today's interview, I was almost thinking, given that your number one category is restaurants, I mean food, which is actually restaurants, and Deepinder, Zomato, I thought you guys are competitors. Maybe in some
yeah. So
tangentially you are.
25% of our business, right? So to that extent, there's an overlap, right?
Yeah.
So what, right? It's fine.
And then I realized that it's almost like Steve Jobs having Eric Schmidt on the Apple board kind of a decision.
Very nice to say those names. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right? Because he's that person who's done that in that space.
Exactly.
And if anything, all you're saying is, I think I value, and there are miles that we have to go, and then you possibly already walked in some of those steps. Let's bless us with that wisdom, so to speak.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So this is a question that I've been waiting to ask. Some part of me tells me, and you heard about the Just Dial acquisition by Reliance, right? That Amazon or Reliance will possibly, some part of me used to say that you are a Google Maps acquisition waiting to happen, because that offline loop closure, which Google is or Facebook are not doing, is what you do very neatly, and it is something that they could port over neatly and say, let's start experimenting in other markets, where because the DNA exists, the formula exists, and they don't need to go through the learning curve that you already have. I think it could work as value for them. But some part of me actually tells me that because there are Indian nuances, it's India market focused, you would be more attractive. Maybe not Reliance, because I think where Reliance is going, a lot of people I don't think haven't peeled the onion, and then what Reliance is actually doing is building something for consumers which are still 5 years away. They're not looking at today's consumers. You're not acquiring Just Dial, because the target segment and the target audience that Flipkart and Amazon have is not the target segment of Just Dial. That's a totally different target segment altogether. And with JioMart and your Kai OS and JioPhone, you're actually looking at people who 5 years from today are going to be your customers and not today. So therefore, I think you're a good target for Amazon. So have you received any interest, and what is your own personal belief on actually selling yourself?
I think we started to build something that lasts and grows and thrives. We've taken the hard decisions to build something that is sustainable for everyone, including us, right? Our interest is to keep our heads down, focus on getting MagicPin into everyone's hands in the country, right? That's the single-minded agenda that we have. I would say we've covered a fair amount of distance. It's become a lot more fun. No way that we are giving up on what we are doing.
Whether you're inside or outside.
Inside or outside, Alan?
In a company or outside on your own.
I get to do what I do if I'm inside. I don't get to do it otherwise.
Okay, awesome. You touched upon culture some time ago. It's been a long time since a founder talked about culture. What's the culture like, and how did you go about putting that in place? Has it been part of your DNA from the beginning?
Yeah, I think culture to an extent is a reflection of who you are to begin with, right? I would say the kind of people who came together. I did not describe my co-founder Bridge, right? He's
yes, I think time to talk about it. How did, because you said he was starting up Lightspeed's India office.
No, that was Bejul. That was
Bejul. Okay, sorry, I got the two confused. Yeah, then I think the right time to talk about how the founding team came together.
So I knew Bridge from Bain. He joined Bain a year after me from Ambassador, and I moved out to Lightspeed at some point. He carried on. Then he was part of Urban Touch, which was Abhishek Goyal. I don't know if you know him, and he was backed by Tiger and Axel. They built a beauty e-commerce business called Urban Touch. Took it to some place, got it acquired, and then Bridge was at Nexus for a couple of years. And he's a very operations-oriented guy. He wanted to be in building a business, and in fact, he was there before I was there to say, "Hey, I'm going to make this. I'm going to start a business." And he was thinking of options. And I would say we were fortunate, or I was fortunate to find him, and I hope you think similarly, around the same time and converge on the same idea to say, okay, this is something that we believe will happen, and that's how we got started. Right now, to some extent, we had similar kind of training in the past, and the intensity and the piece around being outcome oriented, right? That was very much there, and then and I would say building Magic Pin, credit goes to a lot of people over the years, right? It's been a marathon. Many people have come in. Many have stuck. Some have also kind of gone in their different direction, but credit to each one of them to have built it. The culture has always been, I would say, in this direction of very objective. Those three values I defined, right? Which is like curiosity, ownership, frugality. It's like this definition itself is very intense, right? Right. So we are that. We are very much objective, but at the same time oriented towards an outcome and do whatever it takes. Being this, we are not certain other things. Especially the software area, we probably lack a bunch of things, which we are conscious of, and because we are conscious, we are getting better at. But that's what the culture at Magic Pin is, to be very outcome oriented. And do that in a way that it's rigorous and putting your heart into it and seeing that things happen. I'm very proud of people who end up spending more than a year or so. Like they really have built a lot of muscle in that period if they stay. And in general, people who spend the time with us continue to be with us because they like that energy and that excitement.
Amazing. Talk about decisions, some that have worked and some that haven't exactly worked. And
many. I would say,
I'll
just go back to that point we discussed earlier, right? Like there's a problem that needs to be solved. You'll try 10 things, like 4 would go wrong, right? Like 2 of them will somewhat work, but maybe 1 of them will get it to work 80%. We'll take that and we'll move on. We're not very, I would say, hung up about what is the right answer. Let's.
How long before you pull the plug?
I think it's up to the person who's on point. The person owns the outcome. At some point, you're wasting your time if you the outcome needs to be had. So, so it's usually to that person.
Amazing. Do you read?
A little bit, not always.
What's the most interesting book you've read of late?
Interesting question. I'd say that a bunch of things come to my mind. I would say the more softer kind of things have had me more plugged in. Books like How the Mind Works. There's a gentleman named Steven Pinker who talks about what he's written another book called Blank Slate also. I think there are a bunch of these ideas around this is how we make our decisions, this is how we think, this is how much influence we can think consciously of and think subconsciously of. That's been an area which I think I've recently read and is at the top of my mind. I've got a few more things on my reading list which I've not got to yet, but hopefully soon enough.
Do you know the funny thing, Anshu, is that almost all of these books, these behavior mind related books, if you go back and analyze and recall, they are based on the work of just two people. There's another author called Dan Ariely, who's written a book called Predictably Irrational or A Random Walk on Wall Street, stuff like that. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. I've read a bunch of those books. I have read a bunch of those books, and every one of those books that I read used to, Amos, in this paper, XYZ, and then I'm like, God, I can't believe the work of just two people leads to so much perspective. And the seminal book on that is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So it's sort of like the mothership, and all these other books are sort of perspectives on it. And it's very fascinating to read all the other perspectives as well, because there are varying points of view.
Sure.
We're all blind men touching this elephant.
Absolutely.
Right? And the brain and human behavior is like this elephant. It's impossible to fathom where it ends and where it begins. So awesome. This is fantastic. Have you ever, two questions, do you ever obsess that all of this could go away? Does it keep you at night saying, oh gosh, maybe during the pandemic wave 1, but now that you've weathered it and possibly on the top of your game again, do you still obsess that you could lose all of this in an instant, or something could happen?
No, absolutely. As you said, right? I worry where the world would go, and are we on the right direction where the world would go, right? We need to be on top, right? So we worry, that paranoia is certainly there. But at the same time, it's there not in a way that I fret about it. I can be calm and worry about it at the same time. So it's a good place to be. It's like a problem, right? You're in a game. It needs to be played well. So to that extent, I am conscious of it, but not worrying in an existential way about it.
And I'll take it that you don't regret your decision on jumping onto the road of or path of entrepreneurship.
No, I'm really glad I did that. I'm really glad. Yeah, I've enjoyed the last 6 years building what we have built. I feel we've done a fair bit of work. We've grown a lot, but in some way we've just set the foundation. And I don't know if I would have done this in any other way. Even if I had the choice, I would like to do that. I like doing what I do every day.
I honestly think what you've done at Magic Pin should serve as a practical case study in a lot of business schools. I am perhaps one of the few guys who talks about Magic Pin as a growth-oriented company.
Oh, nice!
And
read some of that, Krishna.
No, I mean it with all honesty, because growth as a mindset is a topic. It's one of those topics that everybody is aware about, but very, very few people discuss it. The more widely discussed topics are funding and the prevailing climate and all that. All of those are just symptoms of one aspect, which is growth.
Yeah.
Right? You get a handle on growth. And even today, I have to tell you, because I've been part of startup leadership programs, it's so many startups, like I was telling you before we hit the record button, there's this framework called AARRR, which is essentially about, do you know how you're growing, why you're growing, where you're growing, whether in practice or in theory. If you are not yet on the path of traction, how, why, and where will you get traction? That's the whole point of it. And this is, I talk to so many entrepreneurs, and I've been guilty of that as well. There is no focus. The company that has growth focus will win, because ultimately growth solves more problems than anything else could ever solve. Money can solve a few problems, but growth will solve more problems, twice or thrice the amount of money problems that money can solve. Right? So I would say growth should be the first topic that should be discussed, and then funding. Funding again is only for growth. So I think you are one of the few. It was terrific having you on the show. What words of wisdom would you offer to entrepreneurs that are starting out in India and maybe embarking on this journey who are in their early stages, and what do you recommend they should?
I think the biggest takeaway is that I think we are all, and these people who are starting are very fortunate to be in this day and time building businesses. There's never been a better opportunity. Access to technology, access to markets, more users coming online, distribution getting solved, right? There is not a better time than now to go after something that you believe in. There would be ups and downs, like all of those things will happen. But staying at something that you believe in, right, will always deliver. So we are in a great place at this point in time. Stay the course, see things through. You'd get lucky if you are staying the course sooner or later. Don't just stay the course. I would say that's the most important piece that I would say. And it's not intuitive. It takes time to build that conviction that what I'm thinking is right. But start to believe in what you're saying sooner. The sooner you do it, the more the rest of the pieces of the puzzle would start to come together.
Outstanding. I haven't heard anybody else say that. That's amazing. Luck is a residue of design, as they say. And I think, honestly, I believe we all manufacture our luck. So on that note, Anshu, this has been a fantastic conversation. I know Magic Pin, I actually pray, wish and hope that you grow more. The Indian offline ecosystem and the Indian economy needs more players like you. I think what you have accomplished is still very little against the possibilities that actually exist in front of us.
Absolutely.
Notwithstanding all the revolution that's going to happen online. If anything, online is just a window to what can happen offline. And it has got its own world, not denying that. So I know you'll scale newer peaks. And whenever that peak, you scale a newer peak, we will come back and talk to you what the view from that vantage point looks like. We wish you the very best. And any closing remarks before we say our goodbyes?
No, thank you, Krishna. I'm really glad that we had this opportunity to talk. I enjoyed the conversation and I'm looking forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you, Anshu. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed listening to the show and want to help support our show, please leave us a review by visiting our website, maharajasofscale.com/reviews. It helps other people like you discover the show. I totally appreciate your support. If you're a founder or an entrepreneur or anyone interested in or working with startups, this show is where you see discussions in depth about founder stories, their playbooks, and learn more about growth strategies. Visit our website for regular updates or wherever you get your podcasts and discover more awesome episodes. I'll see you on the next episode. Click on the bell icon and hit subscribe to get the latest episodes.